Johnathan Blackwell, a man who oozed arrogance, sat in his high-backed leather chair, staring down at his polished desk, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth. His cold blue eyes narrowed as his assistant, Clara, hesitantly approached with a file in her hands. "Dr. Samuel Turner," Clara said, her voice quiet, betraying her nervousness. "He's one of the most respected doctors in the country. He's agreed to see you." But as soon as Johnathan heard the name, his lip curled. His fingers drummed against the desk in irritation. "A black doctor?" His voice was laced with disgust, his tone dripping with racial prejudice. "I don't need someone like that." Clara, though taken aback, tried to reason with him. "But sir, his credentials—" "No," Johnathan snapped, his voice booming. "I'll get a real doctor, not a charity case." His words echoed in the room, the air thick with contempt. Clara stood frozen, stunned by his cruelty. But she said nothing. She couldn't. The rejection was final. Outside, Clara walked away, her heart heavy, her mind wrestling with the disgust she had just witnessed. Johnathan sat back, victorious in his ignorance, not realizing that in that very moment he had set in motion a chain of events that would shatter his life forever. Across the sprawling city, the hum of activity outside contrasted sharply with the quiet, orderly atmosphere within Dr. Samuel Turner's office. A seasoned black doctor, Dr. Turner had earned every inch of his success through years of dedication, sacrifice, and resilience. The weight of the countless lives he had touched over his career was etched into his face, a mix of compassion and determination that defined him. As he sifted through medical records, his mind sharpened by years of training and experience, the door to his office opened with a soft creak. Naya, his assistant, stepped in, her face unusually somber. She held a single folded note in her hand, which she placed carefully on his desk. The gravity of her expression spoke volumes before she even uttered a word. "It's from Johnathan Blackwell. He's refused to see you." Dr. Turner's eyes flickered over the note. The name of Johnathan Blackwell, the billionaire, the man of immense wealth and power, glared back at him. Dr. Turner's face remained calm, his features an impassive mask of professionalism, but beneath it, a storm was brewing. He had worked tirelessly to become one of the most respected doctors in his field. His skills were impeccable, his reputation unassailable, yet the refusal of this wealthy man to acknowledge him, to even consider his expertise, felt like a personal affront. The truth of the matter was undeniable. This rejection wasn't due to Dr. Turner's medical competence, but because of something that should never have mattered, the color of his skin. Maya stood quietly, waiting for his reaction, her concern palpable. Dr. Turner's jaw clenched briefly as he stood from his chair, his mind already racing. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the tension in the room thick as he walked toward the window. The city stretched before him, a vast sea of glass and steel, a constant reminder of how far he had come, and yet how far some still refused to let him go. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of steel that Maya could sense immediately. "Give me his address," he said, the words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of a resolve that had been years in the making. "I'll show him just how wrong he is." Maya hesitated for only a moment before she nodded, her face softening with empathy. She knew that this wasn't just about a doctor trying to treat a patient. Dr. Turner was about to embark on something much deeper. This wasn't merely about healing a man's physical wounds. It was about confronting a sickness that ran deeper than any illness, one that no amount of money or power could cure. It was a sickness of the soul, a belief that one human being was worth less than another. Dr. Turner's steps were purposeful as he walked toward the door. He wasn't just going to this man's mansion to change his body's state of health. No, this was a challenge of principle, of pride and of dignity. He was going to remind this millionaire that no amount of wealth could erase the value of another human being's life, especially not the life of a black man who had worked for everything he had, fought for every ounce of respect, and had earned it. Dr. Turner knew this moment could cost him. He knew that standing up to Johnathan Blackwell, a man who wielded influence far beyond his own reach, could result in consequences that might affect his practice, his career, his reputation. But he didn't hesitate. He had faced far worse, and he had learned long ago that the fight for dignity was one worth taking, no matter the price. Slowly, Dr. Turner reached into one of the satchels and deposited the toys. As he stepped into his car, his mind cleared of all distractions. He had a mission now, one that was bigger than just one person. This was about proving a truth that some still refused to see, that respect, compassion, and equality were not privileges, they were rights. Rights that no one should be denied, not because of their race, their gender, or their background. And today, Dr. Samuel Turner was going to make sure that Johnathan Blackwell understood that lesson, one way or another. In the silence of the car, Dr. Turner's resolve solidified. He wasn't just going to treat a man's ailments. He was going to heal something far more profound, something that money could never fix. Months slipped by, and Johnathan Blackwell's life continued at its usual pace, one of wealth, excess, and privilege. The lavish parties, the expensive cars, the endless meetings with high-powered executives and business partners, all served as a constant reminder that he was untouchable, beyond the reach of anyone or anything. He was a man who had built his empire on the belief that he could control everything, that his money could solve every problem, and, for a while, it seemed to work. But something had shifted. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk overlooking the sprawling city below, a strange sensation crept into his chest. At first it was nothing more than a dull ache, easily dismissed as a byproduct of the stress he had been under. "It's nothing," he told himself, adjusting his tie with an air of indifference. "I'm just stressed. It'll go away." But as days passed, the pain persisted. It didn't subside, it grew. Slowly at first, then more intensely, until it became a constant, gnawing presence in his chest. With each passing hour the ache worsened, creeping up into his throat and making it harder to breathe. The very air around him felt thick and suffocating. The sleepless nights followed, and soon Johnathan found himself avoiding his usual routine, unable to focus, unable to function. Each breath was a struggle, each movement an effort. Frustration turned to fear. He could no longer ignore it. Panic began to set in. He called in one doctor after another, each with the same grim diagnosis. His condition was serious. The words echoed in his mind like a persistent drumbeat. Serious. Life-threatening. Desperate for relief, Johnathan sought out the finest medical minds, throwing money at the problem, but nothing worked. The pain was relentless. It was then, in his darkest moment, when he realized there was only one person he hadn't considered, a man he had dismissed, rejected, and until now would never have thought to call. Dr. Samuel Turner, the man he had refused to acknowledge because of his own stubborn pride. But as the pain seared through him and fear tightened its grip, the walls of his arrogance began to crumble. Trembling, Johnathan reached for the phone. His hand shook as he dialed the number, the weight of his decision sinking in with every passing second. He had vowed never to reach out to Dr. Turner, but now, in the face of his own vulnerability, he realized he had no choice. He needed help. The phone rang twice before Dr. Turner's voice, calm and steady, answered on the other end. "Hello?" Johnathan swallowed hard. His usual confidence, the bravado that defined him, was gone. The only thing left was a raw, unguarded fear. I need your help," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, stripped of its usual authority. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, the silence stretched on, thick with the weight of what Johnathan had just admitted. Dr. Turner's response, when it came, was measured and composed, as always. I'll be there tomorrow." The simplicity of the words hit Johnathan like a slap. He hadn't expected it to be so easy, so calm. Dr. Turner wasn't angry, wasn't holding a grudge. There was no satisfaction in his voice, just professionalism. Johnathan hung up, his stomach twisting with unease. He stared at the phone for a long time, still in disbelief. How had it come to this? How had the powerful, untouchable millionaire ended up in this position, begging for help from the very man he had scorned? It felt like a sharp turn of fate, a humbling reminder that no amount of wealth could shield him from the fragility of his own existence. As he sank back into his chair, the once impenetrable fortress of arrogance he had built around himself seemed to crumble. The fear of the unknown was overwhelming, and in that moment, Johnathan Blackwell came to a staggering realization. Despite all his wealth, his power, his control over others, he was just as vulnerable as anyone else. He was no longer the master of his own fate. The next day, Dr. Turner arrived at Johnathan's mansion, his face stoic, yet his eyes never left Johnathan's as he entered the grand foyer. Johnathan, hunched over in pain, tried to stand tall as the doctor approached him. The room was filled with tension, the weight of their past clash still hanging in the air. "Take a seat, Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Turner said, his voice calm but firm. Johnathan obeyed, though his pride burned. He watched as Dr. Turner examined him, the doctor's hands gentle but precise. Every moment felt like an eternity. Johnathan had once looked down on this man, but now, as he felt the warmth of Dr. Turner's hands on his chest, he was beginning to understand. Finally, Dr. Turner spoke. "Your condition is worse than I thought. This could have been treated much earlier if you'd trusted someone capable, instead of letting your pride rule you." Johnathan's face flushed with shame, his chest tight with more than just physical pain. But the worst part? He had no response. Days passed, and Johnathan's condition began to improve under Dr. Turner's care. But the healing wasn't just physical. As Johnathan lay in his bed, recovering, his mind raced. He thought about everything he had once believed, his prejudices, his arrogance, the walls he had built around himself, thinking he was untouchable. One evening, as Dr. Turner checked in on him, Johnathan, now a shadow of his former self, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was blind. I didn't see the truth, and now I have to live with it." Dr. Turner simply nodded. "We all have our moments of realization, Mr. Blackwell. What matters now is what you do with them." Johnathan's voice was shaky as he spoke. "I want to change. I want to do better. I want to make things right." And so he did. Over the next year, Johnathan used his influence to support Dr. Turner's work, advocating for fair treatment of all races within the healthcare system. The man who had once rejected him now became his greatest ally. Johnathan was never the same again. The arrogance was gone, replaced with humility. And, as he stood at a charity event beside Dr. Turner speaking to the crowd about the importance of equality, he finally understood the true meaning of redemption. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe and never miss out on more powerful, life-changing stories. Hit the bell icon for notifications and be part of a journey that will challenge your beliefs, inspire your heart, and leave you wanting more.